Welcome to the Roundtable Consult. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Williams, and I'm joined by my ecstatic and ever so effervescent co-host, attorney Sonia Madison. How you doing, Sonia?
You don't even sound convincing of those adjectives. So perhaps the question is, how are you doing? Are you ecstatic and ever hopeful?
And effervescent. Susan, I'm effervescent. Yeah, well, it's been a interesting turn of events here this week, and um, this is what we'll talk about today, I guess.
Well, tell me, how did and I know we're pre-recording to our listeners, we've recorded this on Wednesday, but how was your Tuesday night?
Pretty sleepless. Actually, I should have gone to sleep right around midnight at 12:30. I think the handwriting was on the wall at that time about what was supposed to happen. Um, Not surprised though, not surprised at all. So most of the election I really didn't pay much attention to in terms of the reporting. So it may have been on in the background here or there, and occasionally would peek in and say, we'll see what happens here. Not different than what I pretty much expected to
But
some
when you say most of the election, you just mean last night, or you mean over the
most of
course
last
of the week?
night. Most of
Okay.
last night.
I was gonna
Yeah.
say we've been talking about it every week.
The counting, yes. The counting of it all. And so you know how they do the play by play, looking at the counties, and consistently showing that Kamala was underperforming Joe Biden, which brings up the whole question about how did we get here? That's the first question: is how did we get to the point where Donald Trump has won? And I want to say it in a landslide, pretty much. I
And
mean,
he
it
got the
was
popular vote, which is the first time.
the first time in how many years that a Republican actually won the Electoral College and the popular vote. An amazing, I think, comeback, considering that in January of 2021, he was a political pariah, and now he has gained all of this support. We can't argue now. We can't even argue, or Democrats can't argue now that they lost the popular vote because he won it, and he won the Electoral College vote handily over Kamala Harris. And so, question is how did we get here?
Well, I don't know if he was considered a pariah among the popular people or perhaps among his own MAGA party. I will say last night I did go to sleep around 11 during the red wave, as they say. And I woke up about 2, saw that Georgia and North Carolina were projected to be for him. And I think probably at the time, Pennsylvania was on the path. And I just turned the TV off and just stared at the ceiling in darkness. Because I wasn't sure what to think at that point. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to think, to be honest, at that point. And then I turned on to CNN, and Van Jones, which I've been critical on, but I will say the last couple of weeks have been spot on some of his commentary. He said that Black women right now are hurt because when you look at the game plan, when you look at all they've done, they checked every box. They galvanized, organized. The Sunday President Joe Biden said he was passing the torch. We talked here on the show. It was the Win with Black Women. Zoom calls were happening left, right, up and down. And then other groups joined in. We also saw a convention that, from my standpoint, was a model going forward. It was a really good Democratic convention. Then going on, she did good in the debate. She had every interview from national to podcast. Even up to her last speech, it was less as focused on Trump as it was more so focused on the future and an opportunist future. And she was knocking on doors Monday night over in Pennsylvania. So I imagine, at least from my perspective and what Van Jones was saying, which I agree with, was this, hey, I have played by your rules. I have checked your boxes, and you're still saying, I'm not enough. You're still rejecting me. And after he said that, I cried a little bit, and I had to turn the TV back off.
He was tearful when he said it. And
And I laugh even now to keep from crying, but it just really resonated with me. I will say, to some degree, looking back, I think God was preparing me for this, because the Sunday before, or this past Sunday, one of the messages at church was about peace and where you find your peace. And it was taken from Matthew, dealing with the storm. The disciples were on the boat, and they go to Jesus and like, hey, are you not seeing what's going on? How are you still calm? And he really focused on, where do you allow your peace? Do you allow your peace in the lack of problems? Do you allow your peace in calmness, or do you lie it in trust? And I thought about that. I also, Dr. Tony Evans kind of touched on it, because he posted on his IG stories a similar message about faith being about action and not about feeling. You can feel sad, you can feel disappointed, but you have to make sure you're still walking in faith. And so, I mean, that made me wipe a little tear in there, but it's nonetheless a still sad, disappointing feeling overall, even though,
yeah,
again, there's peace there.
yeah. I think Van Jones certainly did hit it on the head, hit the nail on the head with that one. I walked into the office this morning to see some very deflated Black women. And I'm sympathetic to that, because I totally understand it's more than just a rejection of a candidate. It almost seems to be the rejection of a population of people who have historically been rejected and overlooked and denied. And it's just done now on a more visible and national scale without a true or legitimate justification. Because I still hear people, even right now, saying, she wasn't qualified. Like, but dude, she was elected as a DA. She was elected as a state attorney general. She was elected as a state senator. She was not state,
Federal, yeah.
federal senator. She was elected as the vice president of the United States. How much more qualified for the position of president of the United States can you be? And then you compare it to Donald Trump. Now, granted, you can say, yes, you can be more qualified by having done it once before. And so in that regard, maybe he was a little bit more qualified. You can make that argument. But that was not the argument that they could have made when he ran the first time. Yet they still found him to be qualified, even though he had no executive experience. And the only
Or
experience,
government, by that matter.
or government experience for that matter, yeah. But yet they viewed him as qualified. And so the question is what's the impediment? What causes you to automatically, when you open your eyes and you look at her, or you look at her resume, that makes you say, despite all these other things, she's just not qualified? Is it her laugh? Is it because she laughs? But you can criticize her for your laugh, but you won't criticize Donald Trump for taking a microphone and making gestures as if he's having oral sex with the microphone.
Among other things. I mean, if it came down to that, I give it to you. Among other things
Yeah.
that he has done, not only during the course of this campaign, but his previous campaigns. Well, so from your perspective, though, because I know we're hearing from pundits, and obviously they're dodging the racial and gender, which, I mean, I am going to get into, but from your perspective, where do you think Democrats went wrong?
Well, let me say it this way. I like Jake Tapper's attempt. I think it was Jake Tapper last night. He was trying to make the argument that he doesn't see it as so much of a rejection based off of race or gender. But what was clear to him, particularly in some of the exit polling, was that the top issues and priorities for most Americans, as and predominantly those who voted for Donald Trump, were the economy and immigration. And what's the guy's name from New Orleans? The political operative. Gosh, I can't think of what his name is. Uh, Carville, Corville, James Corville, I think his name is, who coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." And it may be. It very well may be the economy and the propagation of a message of doom that's out there. I I find it hard to believe that we are consuming as many goods and services as we are as a nation, and people are actually feeling the the pinch of inflation as much as they say that they are. Granted, we all feel the inflation, but if the inflation doesn't stop you from spending, can you really say that it's that bad of an issue for you? Because consumer spending hasn't really slowed down. We're still having problems keeping up with the supply or the demand. And so, which is one of the things that have kept inflation rates high. When the demand is high, supply is low, then the price is going to go up. It's a basic tenet of economics. And so as I look and evaluate it objectively, I think I can't look at the measures, the typical measures that we have for how well an economy is doing, the stock market, the unemployment rate, the number of new jobs created, the length of time that you've had record low unemployment and across all demographics. Those measures are actually pretty good. They're pretty darn good, as a matter of fact. The number of jobs created that he's had, excellent. I mean, you every other measure except for inflation, and even inflation has decreased substantially over the past year. Um, and we expect inflation to be relatively high just because we still came out of the pandemic. And it started actually during the pandemic, and eventually it takes some time to recover from some of these things. And the Feds understands that concept, and they're the ones who actually are charged with the responsibility of monitoring the amount of inflation. But the sitting president is the one who catches the blame for it. And I get that he becomes a political target as a result. But I just think that the narrative that was out there was more persuasive than what people actually felt. And the Republicans driving home, this is the worst economy ever. And, and all
It
people
was
are
better
doing,
4 years ago, right?
yeah, it was better 4 years ago. No, 4 years ago, we were in the middle of the pandemic through the pandemic.
Right.
And but I think that's where that was very harmful to them. I also think that the immigration problem, maybe they should have taken some action a little bit earlier to their fault. But I pose this
By
question.
actually probably an executive action versus just getting the two parties together to come up with a bill.
Correct, exactly. But whatever they did in order to reduce it toward the end of his presidency during this year, you still had 3 other years that you really could have done those same actions. But I do pose this proposition, and that is that I haven't heard a single Democrat say, we have open borders. I haven't heard a single Democrat say that. I've never heard a Democrat say, hey, when Joe Biden becomes president, all of y'all can come over here and we're going to welcome you with open arms. But what I have heard was Republicans repeating the narrative that when Joe Biden is in office, you're going to have open borders. And now the Democrats have open borders. And how do most people in the world now probably get their news, in free worlds at least? And that's through social media. They get little snippets, little clips of Republican officials, United States representatives and senators saying things like, we have open borders under Joe Biden. And all it takes is a couple of clips to be delivered to some place like Venezuela or Guatemala, wherever they're coming from. And that's all they need are a couple of clips to say, hey, look at all the US officials who saying that they now have open borders. Let's go. And they're the ones, I think, the Republicans have promulgated the notion of open borders much more so than Democrats have, who haven't done it at all at this point. But Democrats get blamed for it. And, I have to say it was just a crafty Republican strategy.
I definitely it was a messaging problem, because if you're really being honest, or even a misinformation problem, under Trump's presidency, he brought in a lot of people. And you get the effects during the next presidency. But I don't think the Democrats did a good job messaging. And I will say, to some degree, and I think you mentioned this before in some of the previous podcasts, the lack of a primary may have either helped Joe Biden or even Kamala Harris better message that, because I think, again, there wasn't really an opportunity to defend the economy. There wasn't really an opportunity to defend what the administration had done with even immigration. There wasn't really an opportunity to defend like the student loan, even when you talk about the price gouging. I mean, when you have the price of insulin going down, there wasn't really a period to defend that. And by the time VP comes in, everyone is saying, well, you've got to differentiate yourself. And so without that primary for either Joe Biden or, and by primary, I really do mean a contested one, because if maybe a Josh Shapiro or maybe just some other people had come in and forced Biden to either defend it articulatively, or if we saw him not able to do so, remove him at that time. And then give Kamala Harris to defend what the administration had done. By the convention, we would have known, hey, it's not about as much as, hey, you have to separate yourself. It would have been about, hey, you have defended yourself. We voted for you based on your defense, and we need you to carry that on during the general election. So I do think there was a messaging problem there. And again, when you're the VP, I don't imagine you're going to throw Joe Biden on their bus. And I say this before on this show, Joe Biden did a good job. And I don't think he, unfortunately, gets enough credit for it because of how he handled that last debate. And I know that through social media, I mean, you saw him readily continue to tout, hey, I'm student loan relief, continue to tout, prices are going down, continue to tout, inflation is going down, continue to tout, unemployment rate is going down. But by then it might have been too late, because then we're expecting Kamala to differentiate herself. And I don't think she could do that, given that she's part of that administration. So I definitely agree there was a messaging problem there. But I also am concerned as to how much they could have been able to message well, because to your point, if we're all getting our information on social media, and we've got an Elon Musk who's been very intentional about these algorithms and what you're going to see constantly pumped at you. I will say, I got off Twitter today, but before I was seeing ad after ad after ad of Trump, and I can't tell you if there was nowhere near the same amount of ads for Kamala Harris. If you're able to manipulate the communications and the messagings so well in that, then, it's hard to determine what the Democratic Party could have done in that space.
Now, that's the argument that the Republicans had in 2020. They were saying that the control of social media was favoring the Democrats and disfavoring Republicans at that moment. And so there is, I think one take-home message is the power of social media, and to one spread news, and the other one is spread misinformation. And unfortunately, misinformation, a lie can make it a boost. I think it was Mark Twain said, a lie can make it around the world before the truth has a chance to put on its shoes or something, or tie up its shoes.
Which we saw with the Hurricane Helene and what was the other hurricane? I can't think, but we saw how much disinformation was out there. And even in that, I felt like so many government officials were really frustrated with that misinformation or disinformation. And yet it continued to propel the Republican Party, which is unfortunate too.
You have to be willing to tell a lie and watch it spread a lot faster because a lie will be, much more quickly advanced.
That's unfortunate for our government because then who's going to trust you? Because like we saw with Ohio, those government officials, when we're talking about Springfield, they embrace the Haitian immigrants. And while you have both Trump and JD Vance pretty much arguing that they should not be here legally and that they're eating cats and dogs and whatever, it is, all of it, pets, eating pets. It makes it so much harder for the people on the ground to, again, try to give you some truth because, again, they've embraced what's there. And I think that's something that's going to be concerning in this new administration because not only does Trump have the executive office, but he also has the legislative and the judiciary or the judicial branch. And so his ability to manipulate these truths, and he has been clear, even in Project 2025, I know he's tried to distance himself, but we know that he wants to ensure that whoever is in office, appointed or not, is loyal to him. That will determine the information we receive. And I don't think there is enough trust in national media anymore, which we saw even during the election, how they were really focused, both parties were really focused on podcasts and non-traditional media to send their message. I just don't think there's enough trust in media to discern the truth.
It's true. I hate to keep referencing it, but there's a chapter in my book called "The Extinction of Truth," and we talked about this on the podcast too. It's just that truth eventually just becomes what we choose to believe as true. That comes from a source that we personally deem to be credible. Those are the only two criteria that it will meet. It does not have to have any truthful, factual basis to it. It's just something that we perceive to be true from a source that we perceive to be credible. So we've got issues with the economy, and at least the exit polls say that issues with the economy and the issues with immigration were two key issues. You think a messaging problem was it? I do also think that you just had 100 days to run a presidential campaign. That is just not sufficient to run a presidential campaign, especially when your competitor has been doing this for a year and a half. And so it takes some getting used to, answering the questions and being on the spot and getting your campaign legs down in order to run a presidential campaign. And so by the time she finally starts getting her stride, one of the things we heard frequently about her was her word salads. And, which I'm thinking like, have you not listened to the bowl of lettuce that Donald Trump has been tossing around?
And that's my only thing with that criticism is Trump has pretty much said, I'm not going to do the interviews. Right. I'm not going to
Let's just play music for 30 minutes.
Right. Right, and dance. And I'm going to hit on the same tune of, immigration is bad, mass deportation, migrant crime. And I think that's, again, going back to what Dave Jones said, I think that's what's so frustrating is because there was an expectation of her to do what you're saying, to do all these interviews, to do everything. And there was no expectation of him. And when he even went off script, because I don't doubt that many people in his camp, particularly that last week, when you had the comedy of errors happening, I don't doubt that they were pulling their hair saying,
errors of comedy.
But yet, I think he's like, this is my tried and true, and the message will remain on hatred. The message will remain on division. And he was able to win on it. And there was, to me, no way Kamal Harris could pull off that same message. No way.
Interesting that you say he has a message of hatred and a message of division. And then you hear a lot of the people who follow Trump say that this is all that Kamala is doing is talking about hatred and division and dividing us, and which baffles me while I'm sitting there thinking like, how is it that you cannot see this? And which is the main reason I think that this happened and why he won so handily, is that I just think it was spiritually ordained.
Oh, you're going there. I mean, again,
Yeah.
and this is why I would say, if you're looking at the diplomatic, objective reason, again, I will tell you, fine, it was a messenger problem. They should have had some primaries, and perhaps it would have either been another candidate or it would have been her on the strength of being able to prove that the economy is better and the immigration is better under that administration. But if you're asking me unofficially, again, I'm sticking to gender and race. And here's why. I was having dinner with a friend of mine who, she's a white woman, she studied history, and this is before the election. But she was talking about how on her dissertation, she studied how white women responded to the suffrage movement, particularly elite white women, and how they were extremely resistant of it. I'm sure you probably speak on this in your book, but they were extremely resistant of it because they were comfortable not only with their husband or their spouse having a level of prestige that then allowed them to have a level of prestige, but there was a recognition that, hey, if women are able to have this level of prestige, then they could be at a higher hierarchy than me. And I was also listening to the podcast Throughline on NPR, and they did an episode on Christian nationality, which again, I'm sure is something you kind of get through your book, but we know essentially that means a nation based on Christian principles, not a nation based on the Constitution as we see it now. But it started with the founders, and they talked about how the founders, when they were thinking about First Amendment freedom of religion, they weren't really thinking about having all these different religions. It was really about the main Protestant religion, but the ability to practice it in whatever denomination you choose. And it of course went into each of the founders, and I mean, it was our podcast. I encourage you, if you're listening, to go check it out. But it talked about the progression of it post-slavery, and how, they saw the movement decreasing. And so again, that's when you get the Confederacy, the Union, all that. And then they talked about the progression of it back in 1963, when you had, I want to say it was Goldwater, but he ran against Lyndon B. Johnson, which Lyndon B. Johnson, as we all know, passed the Civil Rights Act after John F. Kennedy's death. And so they were hoping, hey, with the passage of that civil rights, we can use that to bring this back to this Christian nationalism. But again, they lost because Lyndon B. Johnson won. And subsequent to that, then came the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation formed and was able to get an endorsement from Ronald Reagan, which we see them. I mean, they talk about Ronald Reagan like he's the second coming, probably more so than Donald Trump. But nonetheless, even after Ronald Reagan, they tried to use gender equality as a means to, again, galvanize the Christian nationalism movement, and that failed. And so then they pivot to abortion, which is one of the reasons we got here. And so I say in that, it's never been about necessarily any of those issues. If you're looking at the perspective of Christian nationalism as how these people have galvanized, it's not how we've talked about it in terms of making sure you're watching out for the poor, making sure you're, helping marginalized communities. It's really more so the hierarchy of male and female. Men are head of the household. Men are to rule over women, as we see in scripture. And women are to be submissive. And I think they run on that. And even going into the race element, when you listen to particularly a lot of Republicans, but we saw that there was a Latino community that he was able to tap into. They will say, hey, my priorities are Christian, American, then Republican. And when they talk about American, as we saw with Donald Trump, they meet it in the face of a white person. And so when you're looking at those, then hierarchy, we're talking about a male, white Republican. And that's why I say, you cannot deny the gender and racial consequences of why she was just not set up to win.
Yeah, I agree with with that to a large extent. I think it's more of a gender issue than necessarily a race issue. And I do think that that's a harder hill to climb, uh, particularly when you start looking to see how, the number of Black men that voted for Donald Trump has increased, the number of Hispanic or Latino men that voted for Trump as well. Um, you have to start thinking that he's really been tapping into a lot of the paternalism or the paternalistic inclinations that we have as a people. Um, and honestly, I think that's a sentiment that's often shared by other women. It's like you don't want another woman leading us,
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah, that's why I started with my friend who did a whole dissertation about that. And she was telling, I feel like to some degree, God was warning me. And even that message, as well as my church messages. But I feel like she was warning me, listen, women, they're not for this. And I get it to some degree because I mean, hey, I would love to have a man that take care of me and I don't have to work all the time. But I think in the Black community particularly, we're used to the matriarch. And you can call it through unfortunate means or not, but we're used to that. Whereas like we saw in these other numbers, like you said, when you're looking at the white, the Latino and other races, he was able to pull them where he could not pull Black women.
so how do you rationalize that as a Christian woman who believes that the woman should be submissive to her husband? How do you rationalize then putting a woman in the most powerful seat in the world?
Well, one, I don't consider job and family the same. You know? And I think again, and this is why you either decide you're going to follow the Christian nationalist movement or you're going to separate church and state. And when you separate, to me, I choose to separate church and state when it turns to government, because that to me is what the Constitution is called for. And it makes very clear in the Bible, hey, give Caesar what is Caesar. And so then from that perspective, I want to pick the most qualified person for the position. And I also, had it not been, and I've said this before, any other candidate other than Donald Trump probably would have won even more handedly. But the fact that he campaigned on hatred, and to me, that is so opposite of
Well, I don't think that
what
any
you
other
see.
candidate would have won more than him because he campaigned on hatred.
But you're
And
asking me in terms of Christian.
right.
How would I reconcile it from a Christian's perspective? And I think that campaign is completely opposite of what we learn and as we study the Bible when it's all about love. There is no way then I could support that candidate.
How many movies do you go see? Or let me not say you. How many movies do Americans go see that have a negative plot line? Those movies excel and sell out at the box office much more highly than those with a positive message.
Unless it's like 12 Years a Slave or something.
Yeah,
Or
but even
because to me, when it comes to certain historical fiction, they don't want to reconcile with the demons of the past.
but still, there's the evil, inherent evil that's inside there, that was dealing with the brutality of slavery, and so there's something in us that wants to know evil. Is what I'm saying. When you're driving on the expressway, you ever been on the expressway, and then all of a sudden the traffic slows down? You're like, what was the purpose of this traffic jam? And then you finally get to the front of it and you look across on the other side of the interstate, and then there was an accident or a car ran off the side of the road. And everybody on this side is stopping looking at what happened, the tragedy that happened on the other side of the road. There's something I think innate within us that desires to see evil and thrive off of that. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll care to admit it. In fact, I'll even take it back to the beginning, and when God created everything, he confirmed everything and said it's good, right? And then of everything that he created, he said it was good. And then he put man in the middle of all this stuff and said, you can have all of the good. There's one thing that you can't get, and that's you can't eat from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it wasn't that God didn't want us to know what good was, because he set us in the middle of good. So what he didn't want us to ever know is what evil was. He didn't want us to be able to discern what evil was. And so Eve was tempted by the devil by the serpent to to take a fruit of the take a bite of the fruit. And the way that she was tempted, because he reached to her inner desire to know, and to know something that only God should know. And that was evil. So she wanted to know, to be able to see not just good, but she wants to be able to see evil. And I think the same situation probably happened with Adam. I'm gonna give that to you.
Adam is the fall, it's
So
the fall of Adam.
we'll put it on his shoulders. His shoulders are bigger, probably. But
hey, if you want to be the head, then you got to take the consequences.
you got to take the consequences of what you do, what this disobedient woman does for you. And but the point is, I think we have been wanting to know evil ever since then. And we say we don't want to, but there's something in us that is drawn toward evil and drawn toward mischief. It's the Bible. The Bible calls it our flesh, because there's nothing inherently good about our flesh, and so it's constantly warring with the spirit, which is supposed to be our good. And so they're battling constantly. And when you run a campaign that capitalizes off of evil and negativity, people are drawn to that. They're going to just turn on the. Listen, as much as I dislike his strategies, I watch Donald Trump just to find out, what is he going to do next? What is he going to say next? And there's a lot of
maybe
people that
that's a male thing, because and again, maybe that's also part of the Black women understand that they're not even just Black men, but I think people understand in general that Black women are the least protected group. And so anytime, again, going back to the eating of the cats and dogs, that had such a huge impact on the Haitian immigrants that, I mean, I felt for them. I hated it for them. I didn't thrive off watching not only J.D. Vance and Donald Trump sit there and use them as pawns to, again, spew this hatred. I knew to some degree, man, we're next. And then there's a level of fear there. And so maybe that's a gender thing. But to me, I hear you talking on evil. I take it to hierarchy. I just really think people want to feel better than someone else. And I know we've talked about this before, but I don't know if you saw the movie Origin, but you see that caste system that for generations has striven, that people strive on globally, not even just here, but people strive on globally. Even when I was listening to that podcast, one of the things they talked about was how the founders would remove the section of Exodus to ensure slaves didn't read it and take it as a blueprint to leave. And so, I mean, I just think, I mean, and perhaps the two are one and the same, but I just think people want to still feel like, hey, I'm still better than this other group. And because this candidate is making it clear, not only in his rhetoric, but also we've got a woman running against them, the male has to come on top. And we saw that a lot in the numbers as well.
Yeah, so you made the mention about the absence of a primary, and in terms of being able to prepare yourself. Most incumbents aren't opposed. They run unopposed in many cases, and if they do, it's not a serious primary. So that probably was not going to happen very well, or very likely for somebody to run against Joe Biden.
Well, and I say that because that debate was such a turn that if we had saw that during the primary, it might have been a different discussion.
Yeah.
Because again, I'm not saying he still might not have won the primary, but at least there would have been time to, hey, we've got to better make sure you can articulate your message. And if you cannot, then we need to get either Kamala in here to do it for you, or we need to have a little bit more of an open primary to see if the
So
message.
all of that feeds into the narrative that the Republicans developed. It says you can't trust the Democrats. They're all dishonest. They've been telling you that Joe Biden is wonderful, and now all of a sudden, look at him. They've been hiding this from you all along. And now what they're going to do is they're going to coronate this woman here by not running a primary. And so they use that, the fact that they didn't have a primary, very effectively, I think, against them. My Republican friends, one of the main arguments that they just kept reciting over and over again, they just put her in office. They staged a coup against Joe Biden, and now, just put, you know, Kamala in that space without a primary. That's undemocratic. And so that narrative resonated with a lot of people who are just looking for anything. Maybe that's our
And
issues,
that's
that
your thing,
people are just
looking for
looking for
anything,
anything.
because as you mentioned before, at the end of the day, it was about economy and immigration. So if they're just looking for something, I agree with you on that. But that's why I say, if you're looking for an objective reason, I'll give you that one. I'll give you that one. But even in that, I also say that to say, then she likely would not have been the nominee.
I would agree with that. I agree wholeheartedly. She would not have been enough. And there may be a reason for that. And so maybe
Which
that,
again goes to gender and racial tropes.
right,
Yeah.
very, very well may be. And so maybe the fault of this loss can be placed squarely on Joe Biden.
I mean,
And
again, I'm gonna put it again, that's why I say, if you're asking for my authentic opinion, the country's just not ready for a female. And I hear you on the female. I mean, I'm not gonna deny that a lot of this is also female, because I mean, we saw Hillary Clinton. She went through that process. She won the nomination. And while she did get the popular vote, she still didn't get the electoral vote. And we know to some degree the electoral vote is built on racism, as we're counting Black people still 3/5 of a person. But again, I'll give you, hey, if we want to take the race and gender out of it, which I know Republicans are going to say, oh, it had nothing to do with that, then fine, blame it on the primary. But I would tell Democrats, you cannot ignore that. And then I would also tell Black women, hey, I agree it sucks. Hey, I agree it hurts. But so does not having Trump accountable for January 6th. So does not having Trump accountable for those 34 convictions. That to me hurts even more.
so I have to go back to what I was saying. I think it's more of a spiritual thing. People asked me before, who do you think is going to win? I said, in my spirit, I feel like it's going to be Donald Trump. And the reason why is because so many things have been laid out to say, hey, this is the plan of God. And people get so
Plan of
excited.
God.
It is the plan of God. Listen, it's the plan of God eventually for the Antichrist to assume power, right?
I think it's the plan of God that this world would be destroyed. Now, to
Right.
me, when you go back to, was it Samuel or whatever, when the people were asking for a king, and he
Mhm.
was telling them, no, I don't think that's what you want. And they said, no, 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 we do want it. And he said, fine, give it to him. You can, if you want to make the argument, well, that was his plan all along, then fine. I would still make the argument that really wasn't his plan, but he allowed that to happen. And that's what to me, this is the same, because he's been clear, I'm going to be a dictator. I want to make sure everyone is loyal to me. I think it's like deja vu, the same thing.
So let me explain the difference between what I think is the plan and the will of God. I do think it's the will of God that no one perishes. But God, who knows the end from the beginning, has a certain plan for how all these things are going to work out. So the plan is not necessarily God particularly orchestrating and using us as marionettes to make us walk down a certain path, but he's knowing the right circumstances will allow us to respond a certain kind of way. And so he has foreknowledge of what's going to happen, and he allows those things to happen, allows a sequence of events to really to occur that shapes our response to the end that he expects. And so I think I do know for a fact that the Antichrist will assume power. And the way that he assumes power is because people put him there. It's not because he uses military might or anything like that. What he does is he has lying wonders and all deceivableness. So he deceives the people. into believing that he's the one, the only one who can do this, and they willingly give him the power to do that. Now, am I saying that Trump is the Antichrist? I'm not saying that he is. I'm not saying that he isn't. Now, truth of the matter is, I mean, he does have a lot of traits. You know, I wrote a
He's
whole,
definitely not Christ. So then, I mean,
and in the book, I clearly delineate a lot of the characteristics of Donald Trump that would be consistent with an antichrist, including, even for that matter, that he recovered from what appeared to be a mortal wound to the head. And so, and maybe I'm stretching, maybe this is a stretch or something like that, but I think because of the confluence of events and the times that we're living in, where truth is now becoming extinct, and people are, heaping unto themselves profits after their own lust, and they're not even seeking it. They're just basically, that's what the internet is feeding you, more and more and more of what you already believe, more and more what you're already passionate about. That there's just a confluence of events that says, hey, at some point, the Antichrist has to be given power. And the way that he's given power is to perform lying wonders to a group of people who want to put him there, who want desperately, because they look around and they see a lot of oppression, they see a lot of depravity in our society, and they say, hey, we need a change. And whether that depression of depravity, whatever it is, or destitution is financial, whether it's spiritual, whether it's um, security, national security, all of those things all come together to say, hey, we need a savior. And the one who we believe is going to be our savior is not Jesus Christ. They'll never articulate him as their savior, but their behavior says, this is our savior. This is the one who is going to redeem us from the evils of this world. And so they put their faith and trust in a person like Donald Trump. And I would never have made that analogy or either presumption or comparison if he had never very affirmatively said, I don't believe that I've ever asked God for forgiveness. I don't see a need to. That to me is a disqualifying red flag. I don't care what kind of what kind of policy you offer afterwards, or how much you promise me prosperity. To me, if you denounce the doctrine of Jesus Christ, which is simply, redemption through repentance and redemption through his blood. If you denounce that, then I just can't support you. The Bible tells us, have no parts with them, otherwise you become partakers of their evil. But yet, you start watching a lot of people who are now what I call deceived by a deceiver. And if he's not the Antichrist, he is an Antichrist and is laying the foundation for the manifestation of it. We've already now, the first time that you do anything is always the most difficult time to do it. And so with the first time they voted for Donald Trump, many of them went into the voting booths, pinched their nose and said, I'm going to vote for this guy, even though I don't want to. But this time he got even more votes than he got in 2020. And so the reason why is because the first time that you've done it, it's a more difficult time to do it. Say, we're used to now having this philanderer, this very amoral person be in the most powerful seat in the world. And you see people propagating these this meme that said, if he didn't blow the world up during the first term, what makes you think he's gonna, or if she didn't fix it during the past 3.5 years, what makes you think that this time is going to be any different? So
I mean, you're giving a lot of credit. Because I mean, again, I just think that while they may say, oh, I think this was God's calling as your spiritual, and they focus a lot on abortion for that. One, we saw in a lot of the states that put abortion on the ballot, that the right to abortion passed for a lot of states. But two, again, I just think it's a hierarchy thing. I just think the fact that, hey, we have immigrants, and again, the misinformation. We have immigrants here, and this misinformation that they're committing crime, this misinformation that they're not paying taxes, this misinformation that they're taking Black jobs is what got people to say, well, hold on. That I don't think that's fair. I'm American. I should have this job, even though that's not even a job you want. I should not have to pay taxes, even though they are paying taxes. I should be able to deport them out, even though, again, mass deportation will cause high inflation and economic trouble. I just think that people just inherently want to be better than the next person.
How have you ever tried to convince a Trump person even to acknowledge his fallibilities? Have you ever engaged in that type of
No, because
conversation?
to your point in that, because I don't disagree with the idea that they don't care about the rhetoric. I don't disagree with that. But
It's
I'm
not that
saying
they
I
don't
think
care about it, they don't see it. They don't even see a wrong in what he does. You know, many of them, trust me, and I've argued with a whole lot of them. They can identify all of the little, like Van Jones said, she has to be flawless, but he can be lawless. They can identify every minute thing about Kamala Harris, but the very same thing that they're criticizing her about, they don't even see it in Trump. It's not even, I'm like, do you not even see that you're saying the very thing that, you know, the speck in her eye and the plank in his? Uh, I had a friend who was talking about, you know, just recently, black guy actually too, talking about how she's an adulterer and such. I'm like,
she slept her way to the top. I've heard that one.
yeah, I said, because she dated this man who had been separated from his wife, but not divorced for what, 10, 20 years or something like that. He was separated for at least 10 years, I think, before they started dating. But you criticize that and you see how immoral that is, but you don't necessarily think that it's immoral for him to sleep with a porn star while his wife is
Not
just
to
giving
mention
birth.
being divorced how many times and having how many kids by how many women.
So
Uh,
the point is that they don't see it. And they don't see it because their eyes are blinded. Their eyes are blinded because they have been deceived by, I think, a great deceiver.
But I
And
give you that with the MAGA supporters, because I do think that's the cult. But when you look at the trend of, I think it was like 1% of Black men, and then what was it, 3 or 4, almost 10% of Latinos. To me, they see it. I mean, especially when you had him blatantly not only say Mexicans are rapists and murderers, but also talk about Puerto Rico in the way. And granted, it wasn't him; it was a comedian, but nonetheless, he didn't denounce it. And you did have some people, some Hispanics, Latinos come out and say, oh, you know, I can't believe he said that. I'm not against that. But I think they still secretly vote for him. And I don't think that they can make this argument that you're making that I didn't see anything wrong with it. I don't think they can say that. But
it was
again,
a
I just think the
it was
hierarchy
a
is
black
what
man
gets
who
them
was making
voting.
those same arguments for me. And you can never get them to acknowledge that, yes. Try it a couple times. Try to get them to acknowledge the
Try
very
arguing
thing
with a
that they're
fool.
huh?
Try arguing with a fool.
Yeah, right. But just try it just once and see if you can ever get them to even acknowledge that the very thing that they're criticizing Kamala about, Donald Trump is 10 times worse. And they
Well,
just
and
won't
I
do it.
also said, because I did watch this podcast with Lecrae, and he had a Christian Democrat as well as a Christian Republican.
Mm,
And I don't know if you saw this, but they did the
I saw parts of it, yeah.
criticisms. Yeah, they did the criticisms of both. And when it came to Kamala, I mean, I'll give I'll give Democrats in general, I think they will acknowledge, hey, yeah, she changed her mind on something, and that can be a criticism. But when it came to Trump, he was like, well, instead of talking about the criticisms, let's talk about what people are gravitating to. And the Democratic guy said, well, we're just going to ignore January 6th. And he said, no, I mean, I hear that, but they just don't care about it. And
Mm.
that to me is what I feel like is because to me, he never said that, hey, what he did was right. I think he even acknowledged, yeah, that was wrong, but democracy didn't crash. And so let's just then talk about what people are holding on to.
And that's the first step. The first step is acknowledging that, hey, yeah, he did something wrong, but I don't even care. But the second step and the progression is that they were like, he didn't even do it. There was nothing wrong with what he did. That's why the Bible. That's how the Bible says that he turned them over to a reprobate mind. They start off. recognizing that they're sinning, and eventually they just don't care about the sin anymore, and eventually they can't see the sin because they've been turned over to a reprobate mind. And I think when we reject God, we reject God's ways, we reject the way of truth, which I say is Jesus. Then what happens is that we get turned over to a strong delusion to where we can't, that we believe a lie. Oh, all of this was fabricated. All of this is fabricated by the deep state because they hate Donald Trump because he's trying to step in and drain the swamp, and he's going to end child sex trafficking, and he's going to kick all of these corrupt people out. And I'm like, you cannot rid corruption with more corruption. But I think this is just where the mind is. And this is how I rationalize it, at least. I look at it like Jesus looked at the sinners when he was on the cross, and he said, those who persecuted him, he said, forgive them, Father, because they know not what they do. And the reason why I think some of them literally don't know what they're doing is because God gave them a strong delusion. And, that Second Thessalonians says that because they rejected the truth or the way of the truth, then God will give them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. And I am saying this so I'm dumbfounded by how some people just don't. I'm like, are you kidding me? You don't see this. And you can't even bring yourself to say, I have one friend who we were talking about, the comedian who said some pretty offensive things on there. And he agreed. He criticized that comedian should never have said anything like that. That's so offensive. I said, so is Donald Trump wrong for not condemning it? And he skipped all around it, all around everything. And then he talked about Joe Biden saying the garbage. And I said, so should Kamala apologize or clarify her position on that, denounce that statement? Absolutely, she should. So why is it that Donald Trump shouldn't denounce what he said? Well, he didn't say it. He can't control everything that she says. And his whole point was that he doesn't see that Donald Trump needs to atone for anything. And that is beyond just a natural hatred. I see that as a spiritual um, inculcation or a spiritual, I don't want to say possession, but the Bible says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And it wasn't that, because you look at, why would Pharaoh go through everything that Pharaoh went through and not still let those people go? Because it wasn't time for it to happen. And so the Bible says that God hardened their hearts because he already knew what was in them. And I think God already knows what's in these people who would advance very legalistic and oppressive treatments and misrepresent his kingdom, just so that the Antichrist can be established. He says, I need to let this person not be able to see. So I'll give them a strong delusion that your greatest persuasive argument will not be able to relieve.
So, I know we're out of time. Maybe we should talk about this next time. But with that, where do you go from here?
Well, we pray.
Pray for what? Please remove the hardness.
Well, no, I think so. So what happens is people, when they say it was the plan of God or it's the will of God, the problem is that we don't discern why God allowed that. What does God intend? How does this fall into his entire plan? And from my standpoint, it's just a wake-up call for us to say, hey, we need to get prepared as Christians to realize that we're going to be persecuted at some point, but we need to take our hands out of as a Christian, we need to take our hands out of this civil discourse. Second Timothy 4:2 says a good soldier doesn't entangle himself with civilian matters, but he focuses on and does only that which the one who enlisted him commanded him to do. And I think as Christians, we need to get back to doing what Jesus told us to do. And that was to minister to the hearts of the people and not necessarily involve ourselves with the politics. Because when we get involved with the politics, I guarantee you what's going to happen, what's about to come down the pike, especially with him controlling all three branches of government, what's about to come down the pike is a bunch of oppressive legislation and or policies. And And those people who need to hear the gospel the most will view us as oppressors, and they will not hear. And I think that we will give an account for those persons who are obstacles and stumbling blocks for those persons who would come into the kingdom. We'll have to give an account for that. And I don't want to be one of those people to stand in the way of someone coming to know Christ.
Well, I'm on the Exodus path of, well, he guarded their hearts. Maybe I need to plan an exit strategy. Maybe
We're going to be doing a show from Costa Rica. Joining us from Costa Rica.
Maybe this is his way of saying, "Hey, I'm trying to part a Red Sea. I need you to get out of here." And because even with what you're saying, I guess it's about who you're ministering to, because there's no point in ministering if someone's going by your logic. There's no point in ministering to a Republican Party that has had their hearts hardened, that are real, that are going to say what they are. Right. I mean, so all you're doing is trying to save the rest of us for, eternal salvation. But even in that, I'm like, well, maybe this isn't the country for me to minister. Maybe I need to, because again, you can't deny when someone was a popular vote like this, you can't deny that then sends a message about the state of the country that we're in. And I don't doubt that if you were go back to the Israelites when they were in Egypt, I don't doubt that there were several Egyptians that had an empathy for them. But nonetheless, it was God saying, I'm trying to get you out of this situation.
Yeah. Well, there's and I'm going to say this really quickly. There was a dream that the Lord gave me, a prophetic dream in 1998, and I mentioned it in the book. And it was a dream about a bush, and it's the most beautiful bush you'd ever want to see. I don't know if I told you this or not, but I was looking at this. I don't know why I was so mesmerized by this bush. And the Lord was like, "It's a beautiful bush, isn't it?" Yes. And then all of a sudden, it was like this broomstick started hitting this bush, and all types of vermin and insects and everything started flying from it. And but you couldn't see those before because the bush looked beautiful. Now all of a sudden all this vermin is flying out of the bush. Your first inclination was to run, and God said, "Don't run." He said, "What's happening is that bush is my church, and this broom, this stick that's beating it, is," he's like, "that's my spiritual, that's me moving some spiritual activity so that I make the church as clean on the inside as it is on the outside." But when you see this stuff happening, resist the temptation to run, resist the temptation to leave, because I will make the inside just as beautiful as it is on the outside. And I think that's what's going on right now, is that God is just really cleaning that bush out. And as a result, so many of us want to even just abandon the church and be like, abandon the country or whatever it is. But that God has a purpose for us still standing in that place, and he still needs some ambassadors to represent him on this earth, in this country. And we still need to be those and still holding up the bloodstained banner.
Hey, even Jesus said, "I'm done with the Pharisees. Let me go to these other
exactly
parts of the earth."
That's the point. Go find the lost. Leave the Pharisees alone, because they are a lost cause.
Well, definitely, if you have been tuning in, please let us know what you think. Not only your response or sentiments regarding the election results, but also your plan going forward. And perhaps you could inspire me to be a little bit more hopeful. But in the meantime, you can catch us on Saturdays, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. You can also catch us on your favorite podcast platform, as well as YouTube, and a repeat of this episode on Star Radio. Until next Saturday, have a blessed week.